Welcome, dear listener, to this gentle exploration of the ancient world of Egypt, where pharaohs ruled as living gods and mysteries still whisper through the sands of time. As you settle in for this peaceful journey into history, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from and what time of day it is for you. Feel free to leave a comment and let me know. It brings such joy to see our community of history enthusiasts from around the globe. If you find comfort in these calm, immersive tales from the past, please consider subscribing so you won't miss our next historical adventure. Tonight, we'll let the stresses of the modern world fade away as we travel back over 3,000 years to walk among the great pyramids and golden temples of ancient Egypt, the golden sands stretching endlessly under a brilliant blue sky, where colossal monuments pierce the heavens and the mighty Nile flows like a ribbon of life through the desert. This is the land where some of history's most enigmatic rulers wielded power beyond imagination, the pharaohs of Egypt. But what secrets lie hidden beneath the grandeur? What darkness lurked behind the golden masks and jeweled crowns? Tonight, we'll uncover 10 chilling truths about these god kings that might surprise you. Truths that reveal the heavy burden of absolute power and the strange practices that accompanied divine rule. Truth 1. The weight of divine perfection. To understand the pharaohs, we must first grasp the enormous weight they carried on their shoulders. They were not merely kings, they were living gods, the earthly embodiment of Horus, the falcon-headed deity. Every breath they took, every word they spoke, every gesture they made was believed to maintain the cosmic order known as Ma'at. Imagine waking each morning knowing that the very stability of the universe depended on your actions. The pharaoh's daily routine was not his own, but belonged to the gods and the people. From the moment he rose at dawn, priests attended to his every need, not out of luxury, but out of religious necessity. He was bathed in sacred water, anointed with holy oils, and dressed in garments that carried spiritual significance. The golden Uraeus serpent on his crown wasn't merely decorative. It was believed to spit fire at his enemies. The crook and flail he carried weren't symbols of authority alone, but tools of cosmic maintenance. One represented his role as shepherd of his people, the other his power to defend them from chaos. Truth 2. The loneliness of the sacred. Perhaps one of the most haunting aspects of pharaonic life was the profound isolation that came with divinity. The pharaoh could not have casual friendships or spontaneous moments. Everyone who approached him had to prostrate themselves, averting their eyes from his divine radiance. Even his closest advisors could only speak when spoken to. This sacred isolation extended to every aspect of life. The pharaoh ate alone, using golden utensils that no one else could touch. His food was prepared by priests and tasted by servants to ensure it was both pure and safe. He could not show weakness, could not express doubt, could not even scratch his nose without it being interpreted as a divine sign. The loneliness must have been crushing. Surrounded by thousands yet truly known by none, the pharaoh lived in a golden cage of his own making, where authenticity was a luxury he could never afford. Truth 3. The burden of supernatural responsibility. The ancient Egyptians believed that the pharaoh's spiritual state directly affected the natural world. If the Nile failed to flood, bringing the life-giving silt that made agriculture possible, it was seen as a sign of the pharaoh's spiritual failure. Droughts, plagues, military defeats, all were interpreted as evidence that the king had somehow fallen out of favor with the gods. This supernatural responsibility created enormous pressure. The pharaoh had to maintain perfect ritual purity, perform countless ceremonies, and make offerings to hundreds of deities. A single mistake in a religious ritual could theoretically doom the entire kingdom. Some pharaohs spent years studying the proper pronunciation of sacred words, knowing that mispronouncing a spell could have catastrophic consequences. The weight of this responsibility drove some pharaohs to extraordinary measures. They employed teams of priests whose sole job was to ensure that every religious duty was performed flawlessly, creating elaborate backup systems and redundancies that would make modern safety protocols seem simple by comparison. Truth 4. The dark side of royal medicine. While the pharaohs had access to the best medical care available in the ancient world, their treatment often reflected the brutal realities of early medicine. Egyptian physicians were skilled, but their methods could be horrifying by today's standards. Archaeological evidence shows that some pharaohs underwent primitive surgeries without anesthesia. Dental work was performed with copper tools, and infections were treated with mixtures that included animal dung and rotting meat, practices that likely caused more harm than good. Perhaps most disturbing was the practice of mummification preparation that began even before death. Some pharaohs, knowing their time was near, would begin the spiritual preparations for death that included ritual scarification and the gradual removal from normal food, essentially starving themselves to achieve the proper spiritual state for their journey to the afterlife. Truth 5. The price of royal blood. The concept of divine blood led to practices that would be considered shocking today. To maintain the purity of the royal line, pharaohs often married their sisters, half-sisters, or even daughters. This wasn't seen as abnormal, but as necessary to preserve their divine essence. The genetic consequences were severe. Many royal mummies show evidence of genetic disorders, physical deformities, and shortened lifespans. King Tutankhamun, perhaps the most famous pharaoh, suffered from a cleft palate, a clubbed foot, and numerous other health issues that were likely the result of generations of inbreeding. Yet these marriages weren't just political arrangements. They were seen as sacred unions that mirrored the relationships between gods. The pharaohs believed they were literally recreating the divine marriages of their patron deities, making their suffering not just a personal cost, but a religious duty. Truth 6. The terrifying power of royal judgment. The pharaoh's word was absolute law, and his justice could be swift and terrible. Unlike modern legal systems with their checks and balances, the pharaoh's decisions could not be appealed or overturned. He was judge, jury, and executioner combined into one divine person. Historical records describe pharaohs ordering mass executions for relatively minor offences, believing that harsh justice was necessary to maintain Ma'at. Some pharaohs would personally participate in executions, seeing it as a religious duty to personally remove chaos from the world. The psychological toll of wielding such absolute power must have been enormous. Every decision carried life or death consequences, and there was no one to share the burden of responsibility. The pharaoh lived, knowing that a moment's anger or poor judgment could destroy innocent lives, yet also believing that showing mercy to the unworthy could bring divine punishment upon the entire kingdom. Truth 7. The haunting preparations for death. From the moment a pharaoh took the throne, preparations for his death began. This wasn't morbid planning, but essential spiritual work that consumed enormous resources and countless lives. The construction of royal tombs could take decades, employing thousands of workers who labored in dangerous conditions. But the most chilling aspect was the planning for the pharaoh's journey to the afterlife. Lists were compiled of servants, pets, and treasures that would accompany him in death. In the earliest dynasties, this included human sacrifices, loyal servants who would be killed to serve their master in the afterlife. Even when this practice was abandoned, the pharaohs continued to plan their deaths with meticulous detail. They would rehearse funeral rituals, practice the prayers they would need in the afterlife, and gradually withdraw from earthly pleasures to prepare their souls for eternity. Truth 8. The madness of absolute power. The combination of isolation, supernatural responsibility, and absolute authority proved too much for some pharaohs. Historical records hint at rulers who descended into madness, becoming increasingly paranoid and erratic as the pressures of their position consumed them. Some pharaohs became convinced that everyone around them was plotting against them, leading to purges of loyal servants and advisors. Others retreated into religious obsession, spending their entire reigns focused on spiritual matters while their kingdoms crumbled around them. The most tragic cases were those pharaohs who seemed to understand the impossibility of their position. These rulers would alternate between periods of brilliant leadership and devastating despair as they struggled with the crushing weight of being both human and divine. Truth 9. The curse of royal memory. Even in death, the pharaohs could not find peace. Their tombs, despite elaborate protections, were almost inevitably robbed. Their mummies were disturbed, their treasures stolen, and their carefully preserved bodies were often damaged or destroyed. Perhaps worse than physical violation was the manipulation of their memory. Successor pharaohs would often deface the monuments of their predecessors, replacing their names with their own in an attempt to steal their achievements for eternity. Some pharaohs were deliberately forgotten, their names chiseled from every monument, and their accomplishments attributed to others. This fear of being forgotten drove pharaohs to increasingly desperate measures to ensure their immortality. They built ever larger monuments, commissioned ever more elaborate tombs, and demanded ever more extreme demonstrations of loyalty, all in the hope that their names would endure forever. Truth 10. The ultimate illusion. Perhaps the most chilling truth about the pharaohs is that despite all their power, all their divine status, and all their preparations for eternity, they remained fundamentally human. They felt pain, fear, loneliness, and doubt just like any other person. The difference was that they could never acknowledge these feelings, never seek comfort for their fears, never admit their humanity. The golden masks and divine regalia were ultimately just elaborate disguises, hiding frightened, lonely people who carried burdens no human was meant to bear. They were prisoners of their own divinity, trapped by the very power that made them gods. In the end, the pharaohs achieved a kind of immortality, but not the kind they sought. They are remembered not as gods, but as cautionary tales about the corrupting nature of absolute power and the human cost of divine pretension. A gentle conclusion. As we emerge from this journey through the shadows of ancient Egypt, let us remember that even these god-kings, for all their power and terror, were part of the great human story. Their struggles with power, responsibility, and mortality are magnified versions of challenges we all face. The next time you see the serene face of a pharaoh's statue or the golden gleam of an ancient artifact, remember the human story behind the divine facade. These were people who carried the weight of the world on their shoulders, who sacrificed their humanity for what they believed was the greater good, and who ultimately teach us about both the heights and depths of human nature. Thank you for joining me on this gentle exploration of the past. If you've enjoyed our time together tonight, please consider subscribing for more peaceful journeys through history. Until next time, may your rest be peaceful and your dreams filled with the wisdom of ages past. Sweet dreams, dear listener, and may you wake refreshed and inspired by the enduring human spirit that connects us across the millennia to these ancient rulers who once walked as gods among mortals. Yet, even with all their divine trappings and earthly splendor, the pharaohs could not escape the fundamental reality that plagued all who held such absolute power: the crushing weight of isolation. The pharaoh in his private moments, when the crowds had dispersed and the courtiers had withdrawn to their quarters. There, in the echoing silence of his golden palace, surrounded by priceless treasures and works of art that would make modern museums weep with envy, he sat utterly alone. The divine status that elevated him above all mortals also created an unbridgeable chasm between himself and every other human being. Who could the pharaoh confide in when he was considered infallible? who could offer comfort when he was supposedly beyond the reach of mortal concerns? The very pedestal upon which his subjects placed him became his prison, gilded and magnificent, but a prison nonetheless. Consider the pharaoh's daily interactions. Every conversation was filtered through layers of protocol and reverence. Courtiers prostrated themselves in his presence, averting their eyes from his divine radiance. Even his closest advisors spoke in carefully measured tones, choosing their words with the precision of a master craftsman, knowing that a single misstep could result in exile or death. The pharaoh's great royal wife, though elevated above all other women in the kingdom, still approached him with the formal deference due to a living god. This isolation was particularly acute during moments of personal crisis or doubt. When Akhenaten wrestled with his revolutionary religious visions, when Tutankhamun struggled with the complex politics of restoring the old gods, when Hatshepsut faced the unprecedented challenge of ruling as a female pharaoh in a male-dominated world, in these moments of profound uncertainty, they had no peers to turn to, no equals who could offer genuine counsel or comfort. The weight of their decisions pressed down upon them with a force that would crush ordinary mortals. Every decree they issued affected millions of lives. A single word from the pharaoh could launch armies into battle, condemn entire cities to destruction, or elevate humble servants to positions of great power. The knowledge that their moods and whims held such consequence must have been an unbearable burden for even the strongest among them. Sleep offered little respite from these pressures. The pharaoh's dreams were considered prophetic messages from the gods, to be interpreted and acted upon by teams of priests and advisors. Even in their most private moments, their subconscious minds were subject to divine scrutiny and interpretation. The boundary between the personal and the political, between the human and the divine, simply did not exist for these god-kings. The pharaoh's eating habits, his choice of clothing, his manner of walking, every aspect of his existence was imbued with cosmic significance and observed by countless eyes. Royal protocol dictated not just what he could do, but how he must do it, when he must do it, and with whom. The spontaneity and freedom that we take for granted in our daily lives were luxuries completely foreign to the pharaonic experience. Perhaps most tragically, this isolation extended even to their relationships with their own children. Royal princes and princesses were often raised by teams of servants and tutors, seeing their divine father only during formal ceremonies and state occasions. The natural bonds of parenthood were complicated by the requirements of dynasty and succession. A pharaoh could not simply be a loving father. He had to consider which of his children would best serve the kingdom's interests, which would strengthen diplomatic alliances through marriage, and which might pose a threat to the established order. The pharaoh's emotional life was further complicated by the constant threat of palace intrigue. In a world where power was absolute and succession was often contested, trust became a luxury few pharaohs could afford. Brothers might scheme against brothers, wives might plot against rival queens, and even the most trusted advisors might harbor secret ambitions. The pharaoh lived in a state of perpetual vigilance, never knowing who might be planning his downfall or working to undermine his authority. This atmosphere of suspicion and paranoia took its toll on even the most resilient personalities. Some pharaohs, like Akhenaten, retreated into religious mysticism, perhaps seeking in divine communion the human connection denied to them in earthly relationships. Others, like Ramses II, threw themselves into monumental building projects, seeking immortality through stone and gold since genuine intimacy remained elusive. The medical knowledge of ancient Egypt, while advanced for its time, was still primitive by modern standards. When illness struck the royal household, as it inevitably did, the pharaoh faced his mortality with the same uncertainty as any common person, despite all the prayers and magical rituals performed on his behalf. The contrast between his supposed divine invincibility and his very human vulnerability to disease, injury, and death must have been a source of profound psychological tension. Even in death, the pharaoh's isolation continued. While his subjects mourned him as a beloved god-king, his mummified remains lay alone in the darkness of his tomb, surrounded by treasures but bereft of the human warmth and companionship that makes life meaningful. The elaborate preparations for the afterlife, with their retinues of servants and vast collections of grave goods, speak to a desperate desire to carry some semblance of earthly connection into eternity. As we reflect on these ancient rulers and their magnificent yet lonely existence, we're reminded that power, no matter how absolute, cannot fulfill the deepest human needs for connection, understanding, and love. The pharaoh's story serves as a timeless meditation on the price of greatness and the universal human longing for authentic relationship, themes that resonate just as powerfully today as they did along the banks of the Nile 5,000 years ago. The weight of divine kingship pressed upon each pharaoh's shoulders like the massive stone blocks of their future pyramids. Every dawn brought with it the crushing responsibility of maintaining cosmic order. Every sunset a reminder that their earthly reign was but a preparation for eternal judgment. The pharaohs lived suspended between the mortal and the divine, never fully belonging to either realm, always walking the razor's edge between glory and catastrophe. In the pre-dawn darkness of the royal chambers, while the rest of Egypt slumbered, the pharaoh would often lie awake, staring at ceiling frescoes that depicted his own journey through the afterlife. The painted scenes showed him triumphant, sailing with Ra across the celestial waters. But in those quiet hours before sunrise, doubt crept in like shadows through the palace corridors. Had he performed the rituals correctly? Had his offerings pleased the gods? Would his heart weigh lighter than a feather when Anubis placed it upon the sacred scales? The isolation of absolute power gnawed at the pharaoh's spirit in ways that no amount of gold or adoration could heal. Surrounded by thousands of subjects, servants, and courtiers, he remained fundamentally alone. Every word spoken in his presence was carefully measured, every gesture calculated for maximum flattery. Genuine human connection became as rare as water in the desert, for who could truly befriend a god? The pharaoh's children feared him as much as they loved him. His wives competed for his favor rather than offering companionship, and his advisors saw him as a means to their own advancement rather than a man in need of counsel. This profound loneliness manifested in disturbing ways. Some pharaohs, like Akhenaten, retreated into religious obsession, creating entire new belief systems that isolated them further from their people. Others, like Ramesses II, compensated with grandiose building projects that consumed the lives and labor of thousands, each monument a desperate cry for remembrance that echoed across the centuries. The pharaoh's need for validation was as vast as the pyramids themselves, and just as impossible to satisfy. The royal physicians, sworn to secrecy about the pharaoh's health, witnessed firsthand how the burden of divinity corroded the human spirit. They treated mysterious ailments that had no physical cause, chronic insomnia, digestive disorders brought on by stress, and strange paralytic episodes that seemed to strike during moments of greatest political pressure. The pharaoh's body, supposedly divine and eternal, proved as fragile as any mortal's, perhaps more so under the weight of impossible expectations. Palace intrigue swirled around the pharaoh like incense smoke, thick and suffocating. Every meal brought the possibility of poison, every advisor the potential for betrayal. The pharaoh learned to read faces like hieroglyphs, searching for signs of deception in every smile, every bow, every offering of loyalty. Paranoia became not a weakness, but a survival skill, as essential as breathing in the rarefied air of absolute power. The harem, supposedly a place of pleasure and comfort, became another source of torment. Hundreds of wives and concubines vied for the pharaoh's attention, not out of love, but out of necessity. The woman who bore the next heir would secure her position and that of her family for generations. Those who failed to catch the pharaoh's eye faced a lifetime of obscurity within the palace walls. The pharaoh found himself unable to distinguish between genuine affection and calculated seduction, turning even moments of intimacy into exercises in political maneuvering. Perhaps most disturbing of all was the pharaoh's relationship with death. While his subjects could face mortality with the hope of a peaceful afterlife, the pharaoh bore the crushing responsibility of ensuring not just his own eternal survival, but the cosmic balance of the entire universe. If he failed in the afterlife, the sun might not rise, the Nile might not flood, and all of Egypt would suffer. This knowledge transformed death from a natural transition into a cosmic examination where failure meant not just personal annihilation, but universal chaos. The pharaoh's dreams, when sleep finally came, were populated by the gods themselves. But these divine visitations brought more terror than comfort. Ra might appear wreathed in flames, demanding explanations for minor ritual infractions. Anubis would weigh the pharaoh's heart nightly in these nocturnal courtrooms, the scales trembling with each moral compromise made in the name of statecraft. Osiris would sit in silent judgment, his wrapped form a reminder of what awaited even the most powerful of kings. As the pharaoh aged, the gap between his divine image and mortal reality became a chasm that threatened to swallow his sanity. His subjects saw an eternal god-king, unchanging and perfect. He felt his joints aching, his memory failing, his strength waning with each passing season. The elaborate cosmetics and ceremonial garments became not just symbols of power, but desperate attempts to hide the truth of his mortality from a people who needed to believe in his immortality. The royal mortuary complex, begun on the day of his coronation, became both comfort and torment. Each perfectly carved hieroglyph, each precisely placed treasure, each meticulously mummified servant represented security in the afterlife, but also served as a daily reminder that death was the only certainty in a pharaoh's existence. The pharaoh would walk through his unfinished tomb while still alive, checking the work, making adjustments, ensuring that every detail was perfect for a journey he would one day take alone. In the end, despite all the gold, all the monuments, all the worship and adoration, the pharaoh remained terrifyingly human. He loved and feared, hoped and despaired, trusted and doubted, just like the humblest farmer working the fields beside the Nile. The tragic irony of the pharaoh's existence was that in being elevated above humanity, he lost access to the very human connections that might have sustained him through the darkness of absolute power. The pharaohs built their pyramids to last for eternity, but they themselves were as fragile as papyrus in the wind, crushed beneath the weight of expectations that no mortal soul could ever truly bear. Their legacy reminds us that power without love, worship without genuine connection, and divinity without humanity creates not gods, but the loneliest beings who ever walked the earth. The pharaoh's chambers lay shrouded in that peculiar silence that comes only in the deepest hours of night, when even the most restless spirits find themselves suspended between waking and dreams. Yet for the divine ruler of Egypt, sleep remained as elusive as the desert wind, slipping through his fingers like the finest grains of sand from the sacred quarries of Aswan. In those long, solitary hours before dawn, when the weight of the double crown seemed to press most heavily upon his brow, the pharaoh would often find himself walking the corridors of his vast palace, his bare feet making whisper-soft sounds against the cool limestone floors. The servants had long since retired to their quarters, leaving him alone with his thoughts and the ever-present burden of godhood that no mortal shoulders were truly meant to bear. These midnight wanderings had become a ritual of sorts, a desperate attempt to find some measure of peace in a life that knew precious little of it. The pharaoh would pause before the great windows that looked out over the Nile, watching the eternal river flow past in the moonlight, carrying with it the hopes and fears of millions who looked to him as their divine protector and provider. But what they could never understand, what no subject could ever comprehend, was the crushing loneliness that came with absolute power. To be revered as a god meant to be forever set apart from the very humanity one was meant to shepherd. Every conversation was filtered through layers of protocol and deference. Every smile was calculated, every gesture weighed for its political implications. Even his closest advisors, his most trusted viziers, approached him with the careful reverence reserved for divine beings, never as a friend, never as an equal. The pharaoh's wives, numerous though they might be, were bound to him by duty and political alliance, rather than genuine affection. The great royal wife, chosen for her noble bloodline and diplomatic value, performed her ceremonial functions with practiced grace, but their private moments together were often stilted affairs, weighted down by the expectations of their respective roles. She was the queen, he was the living god, and between them stretched an invisible chasm that no amount of shared intimacy could truly bridge. Even more heartbreaking was his relationship with his children. The royal princes and princesses, raised from birth to understand their father's divine nature, approached him with the same mixture of awe and fear that characterized all his interactions. They bowed in his presence, spoke only when spoken to, and viewed him not as a loving parent, but as the earthly manifestation of the gods themselves. How could a child run to embrace a father who was taught to be untouchable? How could genuine affection flourish in an atmosphere of such rigid formality? The pharaoh often wondered if this was the price of divinity, this eternal separation from the very creatures he was meant to protect and guide. In his darkest moments, usually during these sleepless nights, he would question whether the gods themselves experienced such isolation. Did Ra, journeying alone across the sky each day, feel the weight of solitude as he illuminated the world below? Did Osiris, ruling over the realm of the dead, long for the simple companionship of the living? These thoughts would lead him deeper into the palace, past the sleeping quarters of his household, beyond the audience chambers where he held court, and into the more private areas where few were permitted to tread. Here, in a small chamber that contained none of the usual trappings of royalty, the pharaoh kept his most personal possessions. Not the golden treasures that would accompany him to the afterlife, but simple objects that reminded him of his humanity. There was a clay cup, crudely made but dear to him, because it had been fashioned by his own hands during a rare moment of childhood freedom, before the full weight of his destiny had settled upon his shoulders. A withered flower, pressed between sheets of papyrus, from the last time he had been able to walk freely through the palace gardens without ceremony or guard. A small wooden carving of a bird in flight, created by an artisan whose name he had never learned, but whose work had captured something essential about the freedom the pharaoh himself would never know. These objects were his secret treasures, more precious to him than all the gold in his royal treasury, because they represented the man beneath the crown, the human heart that beat within the divine facade. In this quiet chamber, away from the eyes of courtiers and subjects, he could allow himself to remember what it felt like to be simply human, to experience emotions without political consequence, to exist without the constant awareness of his own mythical status. But even these moments of respite were tinged with melancholy, for they served only to highlight the vast gulf between what he was and what he might have been. The pharaoh understood, with a clarity that was both blessing and curse, that his humanity was something to be hidden, suppressed, carefully managed lest it interfere with the divine role he was destined to fulfill. To show weakness was to threaten the very foundation of Egyptian society. To display doubt was to undermine the cosmic order that depended upon his unwavering strength and wisdom. And so he learned to wear his loneliness like another piece of royal regalia, invisible to all but himself, yet as much a part of his identity as the ceremonial beard or the sacred uraeus serpent that adorned his crown. He became expert at the performance of godhood, speaking with the voice of divine authority while his human heart remained carefully locked away, beating out its solitary rhythm in the hidden chambers of his soul. The weight of this isolation was perhaps most crushing during the great festivals and ceremonies that marked the Egyptian calendar. Surrounded by thousands of worshippers, receiving their adoration and praise, the pharaoh would stand upon his golden dais, feeling more alone than ever. Their love was not for him, but for what he represented. Their devotion was to the divine office he held, not to the man who held it. In the midst of their celebration, he remained fundamentally untouchable, unreachable, locked within the golden prison of his own godhood. Even his dreams offered no escape from this burden. Sleep, when it finally came, brought visions that were interpreted by the court priests as messages from the gods, further evidence of his divine nature. He could not even experience the simple pleasure of an ordinary dream without it being analyzed, recorded, and woven into the complex tapestry of royal mythology that surrounded his every breath. The pharaoh's meals were elaborate affairs, prepared by teams of skilled cooks and served with great ceremony. Yet he often found himself longing for the simple pleasure of sharing a humble meal with a friend, of laughing over wine, without wondering how his laughter might be interpreted or misunderstood. Every bite was tasted first by others to ensure it contained no poison, every cup examined for signs of treachery, until even the basic act of nourishment became another reminder of his isolation and vulnerability. His correspondence, too, was filtered through layers of scribes and advisors, each letter carefully crafted to project the appropriate image of divine wisdom and authority. He could not simply write a personal note or express a spontaneous thought without it becoming part of the official record, another piece of evidence in the great documentation of his reign. Even his words belonged not to him, but to the eternal image of pharaonic power that would outlive his mortal form. In his most honest moments, the pharaoh recognized that this loneliness was perhaps the greatest price of his exalted position. The golden cage of divinity offered many compensations: absolute power, unimaginable wealth, the devotion of millions, but it could not provide the simple human comfort of genuine companionship, of being known and loved for oneself rather than for one's position. And yet, despite the crushing weight of this isolation, the pharaoh continued to fulfill his divine role with dedication and grace. For he understood that his personal suffering was insignificant compared to the stability and prosperity his reign brought to Egypt. The cosmic order depended upon his willingness to sacrifice his humanity upon the altar of divinity, and he accepted this burden not with joy, but with the stoic resignation of one who understands the true cost of greatness. As the first faint light of dawn began to creep across the eastern horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, the pharaoh would make his way back to his chambers to prepare for another day of divine performance. The servants would soon arrive to assist with his morning ablutions. The priests would gather to conduct the daily rituals, and the great machinery of royal life would once again spring into motion. But in those final moments of solitude, as he stood watching the sun god Ra begin his eternal journey across the heavens, the pharaoh would allow himself one last moment of purely human longing. He would imagine, just for an instant, what it might feel like to walk among his people not as their god, but as their friend, to laugh without calculation, to weep without shame, to love without the barrier of divine protocol standing always between himself and those he cared for most. Then, with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of dynasties, he would set aside these impossible dreams and prepare once again to don the mask of godhood, to speak with the voice of the divine, and to carry the burden of a nation's hopes and fears upon shoulders that, beneath all the golden ornaments and sacred symbols, remained heartbreakingly irreducibly human. The weight of divine kingship pressed down upon the pharaoh's shoulders like the heavy stone blocks of the pyramids themselves. Each morning brought not just the golden rays of Ra across the Nile, but a crushing awareness of cosmic responsibility that would have broken lesser mortals. For the pharaoh was not merely a king ruling over subjects, but a living God walking among humans, expected to maintain the delicate balance between heaven and earth with every breath he drew. Picture, if you will, the pharaoh's private moments in the pre-dawn darkness, when the palace lay silent save for the distant murmur of the Nile. In these stolen hours before the world awakened, he could almost forget the terrible burden of his divine nature. But as consciousness fully returned, so too did the weight of his role as the cosmic hinge upon which all of Egypt's fate turned. The crops that would feed millions, the floods that brought life or destruction, the very movement of the sun across the sky, all of these depended, according to Egyptian belief, upon his perfect execution of sacred rituals and his unwavering righteousness. The psychological toll of such responsibility cannot be overstated. Modern minds struggle to comprehend the suffocating pressure of believing that one's every action could bring prosperity or catastrophe to an entire civilization. The pharaoh lived with the constant awareness that a single misstep in ritual, a moment of spiritual weakness, or an error in judgment could invite divine wrath upon all of Egypt. This was not mere superstition to him, but the fundamental reality of existence itself. In the depths of his opulent chambers, surrounded by golden artifacts and precious stones that caught the lamplight like imprisoned stars, the pharaoh often found himself wrestling with doubts that he could share with no one. The scribes and priests who chronicled his reign recorded only his divine perfection, his flawless execution of cosmic duties, his seamless connection to the gods. But in the privacy of his own thoughts, he was acutely aware of his humanity, of the trembling in his hands during crucial rituals, of the moments when he questioned whether the gods truly heard his prayers. The isolation inherent in his position created a peculiar form of psychological torment. Surrounded constantly by advisors, servants, priests, and courtiers, the pharaoh was perhaps the loneliest person in all of Egypt. Every relationship was filtered through the lens of his divinity, every conversation carefully orchestrated to maintain the illusion of his godlike perfection. Even his closest family members approached him with the reverence due to a deity, their natural affection tempered by religious awe. Consider the pharaoh's relationship with his own children, who from their earliest years were taught to see their father not simply as a parent, but as the living embodiment of Horus. A simple embrace between father and child became a sacred act, a moment of divine contact that carried spiritual significance beyond mere human affection. The pharaoh watched his children grow through this distorting lens of divinity, knowing that they too would one day bear the crushing weight of cosmic responsibility if they inherited the throne. The constant performance of perfection required tremendous psychological energy. Every public appearance, every religious ceremony, every royal audience demanded flawless execution. The pharaoh could never appear tired, uncertain, or troubled, for such human weaknesses would undermine the very foundations of Egyptian society. He learned to mask his fears behind the golden death mask of divine composure, to speak with unwavering authority, even when plagued by doubt, to project supernatural confidence while his human heart raced with anxiety. Sleep, when it finally came, offered little respite. The pharaoh's dreams were considered divine communications, messages from the gods that required careful interpretation and response. Even in unconsciousness, he could not escape the burden of his cosmic role. Nightmares about failing in his duties, about bringing catastrophe upon Egypt through some unknown transgression, haunted his rest. He often awakened more exhausted than when he had retired, his mind having wrestled throughout the night with divine mysteries and prophetic visions. The physical demands of his role added another layer to his psychological burden. The elaborate daily rituals required hours of standing, chanting, and precise movements, while wearing heavy ceremonial regalia. The golden crowns, ornate jewelry, and thick cosmetics that marked his divine status became instruments of physical discomfort that he could never acknowledge. His feet ached from standing on marble floors during lengthy ceremonies, his neck strained under the weight of ceremonial headdresses, his skin irritated by the metallic paints and oils that transformed him from man to God each morning. Yet perhaps the cruelest aspect of the pharaoh's psychological burden was his awareness of his own mortality contrasted against the eternal nature of his divine role. He knew, with the certainty that comes only to those who have seen others die, that his own human form would one day fail. But the cosmic responsibilities he bore were eternal, destined to pass to his successor in an unbroken chain stretching back to the first pharaoh and forward to the end of time. This created an existential anxiety that modern minds can barely fathom, the knowledge that one is simultaneously eternal and mortal, divine and human, perfect and flawed. The pharaoh's meals, taken in magnificent halls surrounded by golden vessels and exotic delicacies, became exercises in cosmic performance. Each bite was observed, each gesture noted and interpreted for signs of divine favor or displeasure. The simple human pleasure of eating was transformed into another ritual responsibility, another opportunity for failure in the eyes of his subjects and the gods. Even the most basic biological functions carried spiritual weight and political significance. In quieter moments, when protocol allowed brief respites from the constant performance of divinity, the pharaoh might find himself staring out across the Nile, watching the eternal flow of water that had sustained Egypt since time immemorial. In these contemplative interludes, the full weight of his existence would settle upon him like desert sand, fine and inescapable. He was the steward of a civilization that had flourished for thousands of years before his birth and would, God's willing, continue for thousands of years after his death. The responsibility for maintaining this continuity, for ensuring that the cosmic order remained intact during his reign, created a psychological pressure that would have crushed ordinary mortals. The pharaoh's relationship with the divine realm itself became a source of both comfort and torment. In the depths of the temple sanctuaries, during the most sacred rituals, he sometimes experienced moments of genuine transcendence, brief glimpses of the cosmic order he was meant to serve. These experiences validated his divine nature and purpose, filling him with profound peace and certainty. But they were fleeting, and their absence during other rituals left him questioning whether he had somehow lost favor with the gods, whether his human imperfections were beginning to show through the divine facade. As the years of his reign accumulated, the psychological burden often manifested in physical symptoms that the royal physicians attributed to the strain of divine service. Chronic headaches, digestive troubles, and unexplained fatigue plagued many pharaohs, their bodies rebelling against the unnatural demands of their cosmic role. Yet these ailments could never be acknowledged publicly, for they would suggest weakness in one who was supposed to embody divine perfection. The pharaoh's legacy concerns added another dimension to his psychological struggles. He was acutely aware that his reign would be judged not only by his contemporaries, but by future generations, by the gods themselves, and by the cosmic order that would either flourish or suffer based on his actions. This created a paralyzing perfectionism, an inability to make decisions without extensive consultation of omens, oracles, and divine signs. Every choice, from the grandest military campaign to the smallest ceremonial detail, carried the weight of eternal consequence. And so the pharaoh existed in a state of perpetual psychological tension, his divine nature at constant war with his human limitations, his cosmic responsibilities weighing against his mortal frame, his public perfection masking private doubts and fears that could never be expressed or resolved. He was the loneliest figure in a crowded palace, the most burdened soul in a kingdom of plenty, the most anxious heart beneath the most golden exterior. In this state of profound psychological complexity, the pharaoh ruled over Egypt, maintaining the facade of divine perfection while struggling with the fundamental contradictions of his existence. The golden death mask that would one day cover his face in the tomb was perhaps fitting, for in many ways he had been wearing a mask his entire life, hiding his humanity behind the brilliant but suffocating glory of divinity. The weight of divine kingship pressed upon the pharaoh's shoulders, like the crushing stones of the pyramids themselves. Each morning brought the same relentless burden, the same impossible expectations, the same suffocating isolation that had driven lesser men to madness. For while the people of Egypt bowed before their living God, seeing only glory and power radiating from the golden throne, the man beneath the crown knew a different truth. He knew the terror of failing not just a kingdom, but the very cosmos itself. The pharaoh's private chambers, hidden deep within the palace walls, told a story that no courtier would ever witness. Here, away from the ceremonial masks and divine pageantry, the god-king would pace the polished floors in the hours before dawn, his bare feet making no sound on the cool limestone. Sleep had become an enemy more formidable than any foreign army, for when consciousness finally fled, it brought with it dreams that chilled him to the bone. In these visions he saw the Nile running backward, its sacred waters abandoning Egypt and leaving nothing but cracked earth and the bones of fish scattered like broken promises across the riverbed. He dreamed of the sun failing to rise, of Ra himself turning his face away in disgust at some unknown transgression. Most terrifying of all were the dreams where he stood naked before the great statue of Amun-Ra in the temple, stripped of all royal regalia, while the god's stone eyes wept tears of blood. The pharaoh understood, as few mortals ever could, that his every breath was measured against the rhythm of the cosmos. When the Nile flooded at precisely the right moment, it was because he had pleased the gods through his perfect execution of the morning rituals. When the harvest was bountiful, it was because his prayers had been pure, his offerings sufficient, his heart aligned with Ma'at. But when drought threatened, when foreign armies pressed at the borders, when disease crept through the villages like a hungry serpent, the fault lay squarely upon his shoulders. The isolation was perhaps the cruelest aspect of his divine burden. Surrounded always by hundreds of servants, advisors, priests, and supplicants, the pharaoh lived in a desert of loneliness more vast than the Sahara itself. Every word spoken in his presence was carefully weighed and measured. Every gesture was calculated for political advantage. Every smile was a mask hiding ambition, fear, or calculation. True companionship, the simple pleasure of honest conversation, had been sacrificed upon the altar of his divinity. Even his wives and children approached him with the reverence due to a god, their love filtered through layers of protocol and religious awe. His children learned to prostrate themselves before speaking to their father, to avert their eyes from his divine countenance. The tender moments of parenthood that common men took for granted were foreign concepts in the royal household. How could one embrace a god? How could one laugh freely in the presence of divine authority? The physical toll of maintaining divine perfection was equally exhausting. The pharaoh's body was not merely his own, but a sacred vessel that must remain unblemished and pure. Every morning brought the ritual examination by the royal physicians, who searched for any sign of aging, illness, or imperfection that might suggest the god's displeasure. His diet was strictly controlled, each meal blessed and purified. His exercise was ceremonial, his rest scheduled according to astronomical calculations. But it was the weight of the future that pressed most heavily upon the pharaoh's mind. For he knew, as surely as he knew the sun would set in the west, that death would eventually claim even his divine form. And when that moment came, would he be found worthy? Would the gods accept his bar into the eternal realm, or would he face the ultimate horror of spiritual annihilation? The elaborate preparations for his afterlife, the construction of his tomb, the accumulation of grave goods, all served as constant reminders of his mortality. The pharaoh had witnessed the fate of his predecessors whose mummies now lay silent in their golden sarcophagi. He had seen how quickly the living forgot the dead, how new dynasties arose to claim divine mandate, while the old gods' names were chiseled from temple walls. The impermanence of even divine kingship haunted his quiet moments, whispering that all his struggles, all his sacrifices, might ultimately prove meaningless in the vast sweep of eternity. In the depths of night, when the palace lay shrouded in darkness, and even the most devoted servants had retired to their quarters, the pharaoh would sometimes steal away to his private rooftop garden. Here, under the vast canopy of stars that the ancient Egyptians believed to be the body of the sky goddess Nut, he could allow himself a few precious moments of vulnerability. Sometimes tears would come, hot and silent, for the man he might have been, for the simple pleasures forever denied him, for the crushing loneliness of his exalted position. The irony was not lost on him that he, who commanded the worship of millions, who was revered as the living embodiment of divine power, felt more isolated and powerless than the humblest farmer working the fields along the Nile. The farmer could laugh with his children, could love his wife without ceremony, could sleep peacefully without the weight of cosmic responsibility crushing his dreams. Yet even in these moments of deepest despair, the pharaoh could not entirely escape the conditioning of his divine upbringing, for he had been taught from birth that his suffering was sacred, that his isolation was the price of his divine nature, that his loneliness was a necessary sacrifice for the good of Egypt. The gods demanded perfection from their earthly representative, and he would provide it, no matter the cost to his human heart. As the years passed and the weight of kingship settled ever more heavily upon his shoulders, the pharaoh began to understand why so many of his predecessors had turned to increasingly elaborate rituals and monuments. The great pyramids, the towering obelisks, the vast temple complexes were not merely displays of power or preparations for the afterlife. They were desperate attempts to create something permanent, something that would outlast the fragile human vessel that housed the divine spark. In his darker moments, the pharaoh wondered if the gods themselves understood the price of their earthly representation. Did Ra comprehend the loneliness of his chosen vessel? Did Osiris appreciate the terror that gripped his living representative each night as sleep approached? Or were the gods as distant and indifferent as the stars that wheeled overhead, caring nothing for the suffering of the mortal who carried their divine authority? The questions remained unanswered, hanging in the perfumed air of the royal chambers like incense that would never fully dissipate. And as another sleepless night stretched toward dawn, the pharaoh would eventually return to his golden bed, pull the finest linen over his aching head, and prepare once again to don the mask of divinity that the coming day would demand. For whether the gods cared or not, whether his suffering had meaning or not, Egypt required its living God, and he would not fail in his sacred duty, no matter how heavily the crown weighed upon his all-too-human soul. As we've explored the profound loneliness and immense burdens that define the lives of ancient Egyptian pharaohs, we begin to see how their divine status became both their greatest privilege and their heaviest curse. These god-kings, despite their unimaginable wealth and power, lived lives marked by isolation, constant pressure, and the crushing weight of cosmic responsibility. The pharaoh's existence was a carefully choreographed dance between the human and divine realms. Every morning brought the same ritualistic awakening, surrounded by servants who attended to his physical needs while maintaining the reverent distance required when serving a living god. The elaborate grooming process, the anointing with sacred oils, the donning of ceremonial regalia, all of it served to transform the mortal man into the divine vessel expected by his people. Yet beneath the golden mask and jeweled crowns, the pharaoh remained fundamentally human. He experienced doubt, fear, and the gnawing awareness of his own mortality. The very rituals designed to affirm his godhood served as daily reminders of the impossible standards he was expected to maintain. One misstep in the sacred ceremonies, one failure to properly commune with the gods, could spell disaster for the entire kingdom. The pharaoh's relationships, too, were shaped by this divine burden. His wives, children, and closest advisors all approached him through the lens of his sacred status. Genuine intimacy became nearly impossible when every interaction was filtered through religious protocol and political calculation. Even in his private moments, the pharaoh could never fully escape the weight of his role or the expectations of his divine nature. Perhaps most haunting of all was the pharaoh's relationship with death and eternity. While his subjects lived with the hope of a peaceful afterlife, the pharaoh bore the tremendous responsibility of ensuring not only his own successful journey to the afterlife, but also the continuation of cosmic order through his eventual deification. The elaborate tomb preparations, the complex funerary rituals, and the massive monuments built in his honor all served as constant reminders of the ultimate test that awaited him. In the end, the pharaohs achieved a form of immortality, though perhaps not in the way they originally envisioned. Their names echo through history, their monuments still inspire awe, and their stories continue to fascinate us thousands of years later. But this immortality came at a profound cost, the sacrifice of their humanity on the altar of divine kingship. The pharaoh's legacy reminds us that ultimate power, even when sanctified by religious authority, cannot shield us from the fundamental challenges of the human condition. Their gilded isolation serves as a timeless cautionary tale about the price of absolute authority and the tragic loneliness that can accompany even the most exalted positions in human society. As the darkness deepened over the land of Egypt, a profound and unsettling silence began to settle across the kingdom. It wasn't the comfortable quiet of evening rest, but rather the heavy, oppressive stillness that comes when the very foundations of existence begin to tremble. The 8th plague was approaching, and with it would come a terror so complete, so absolute, that even the most hardened hearts would finally begin to understand the true scope of divine power they had been defying. Picture yourself standing on the banks of the Nile as twilight fades into night. The air feels different somehow, charged with an energy that makes your skin prickle with unease. There's a strange quality to the wind, a subtle shift in the atmosphere that speaks of something momentous approaching. The very birds seem to sense it, falling silent in their roosts, while the usual evening sounds of the Egyptian countryside fade away into an almost supernatural quiet. In the great palace of Pharaoh, the king himself paces restlessly through corridors that have witnessed 7 previous demonstrations of Hebrew power. His advisors huddle in worried clusters, their faces drawn with the strain of months of escalating catastrophe. The magicians who once stood proudly before their sovereign, demonstrating their mystical arts with confidence and flair, now speak in hushed whispers, their eyes darting nervously toward the shadows that seem to grow longer and darker with each passing moment. The 7th plague, the devastating hailstorm that had shattered Egypt's agricultural hopes, had left scars across the landscape that would take years to heal. Fields that had once stretched green and golden to the horizon now lay broken and barren, dotted with the splintered remains of trees and the crumbled walls of buildings that had stood for generations. The economic devastation was staggering, but perhaps even more troubling was the growing sense among the Egyptian people that their gods, their priests, and their divine pharaoh were powerless against this Hebrew deity who seemed to command the very forces of nature itself. Yet Pharaoh's heart remained hardened, his pride intact, despite the mounting evidence of his powerlessness. In his mind, each plague had been a test, a challenge to be endured rather than a message to be heeded. He had convinced himself that this string of disasters was temporary, that his gods would eventually reassert their dominance and restore the natural order. After all, he was Pharaoh, the living embodiment of divine authority on earth. How could he bow to the demands of a ragtag group of Hebrew slaves and their invisible God? But as Moses and Aaron prepared for their next encounter with the Egyptian ruler, they carried with them a promise of devastation unlike anything that had come before. The eighth plague would not merely damage Egypt's agriculture or economy. It would strike at something far more fundamental, something that touched the very essence of Egyptian identity and religious belief. The locust swarms that were about to descend upon Egypt were not ordinary insects driven by natural cycles of population and migration. These were agents of divine judgment, countless billions of creatures moving with supernatural coordination and purpose. Ancient texts describe them as forming clouds so vast and dense that they blocked out the sun itself, turning day into a twilight gloom that spoke of apocalyptic transformation. As the first scouts began to appear on the horizon, tiny dark specks against the evening sky, those who saw them might have initially dismissed them as nothing more than birds returning to their roosts. But as the specks grew larger and more numerous, as the distant hum of countless wings began to reach human ears, the terrible truth became undeniable. This was no natural phenomenon, no seasonal migration that could be predicted and prepared for. This was judgment incarnate, descending from the heavens with the inexorable force of divine will. The psychological impact on the Egyptian population was immediate and profound. 7 previous plagues had tested their resilience, their faith in their gods, and their system of belief. But this 8th demonstration of Hebrew power seemed to carry with it an almost conscious malevolence, a deliberate targeting of everything that made Egyptian civilization great and proud. The locusts weren't just insects seeking food. They were instruments of a god who seemed to understand exactly how to strike at the heart of Egyptian identity. In the temples scattered throughout the kingdom, priests who had confidently proclaimed the superiority of Egyptian deities now found themselves struggling to explain the inexplicable. How could Ra, the mighty sun god, allow his light to be blocked by mere insects? How could Isis, protector of the land, permit such devastation to fall upon her people? The theological implications were staggering, forcing even the most devout Egyptians to question fundamental assumptions about the nature of divine power and protection. As the locust clouds continued to gather and darken, moving with an intelligence that defied natural explanation, families throughout Egypt began to make desperate preparations. Granaries were sealed, livestock driven to shelter, and precious possessions hidden away in the vain hope that they might somehow escape the coming devastation. But there was a growing sense among the people that this plague would be different, that no amount of human preparation could protect them from what was about to unfold. The economic ramifications alone were enough to inspire terror in the hearts of Egypt's merchant classes and administrative officials. The kingdom's wealth was built upon agriculture, upon the reliable cycles of planting and harvest that had sustained civilization along the Nile for countless generations. If the locusts consumed what little remained after the hailstorm, if they devoured not just the current season's growth, but the stored grain that represented years of accumulated prosperity, then Egypt faced not just temporary hardship, but potential collapse. Foreign ambassadors and traders who had come to Egypt expecting to find the greatest civilization on earth, instead witnessed a kingdom in the grip of supernatural siege. The stories they would carry back to their homelands would spread far beyond Egypt's borders, establishing the reputation of the Hebrew god as a force to be reckoned with, a deity whose power extended far beyond the tribal boundaries of the enslaved people. In the Hebrew quarters of Goshen, the atmosphere was markedly different. While Egypt prepared for devastation, the Israelites experienced a strange sense of anticipation mixed with sorrow for their oppressors. They had witnessed the power of their God demonstrated again and again, but many among them took no joy in the suffering of the Egyptians. They understood that they were witnessing not mere divine revenge, but a cosmic demonstration of justice, a necessary breaking of chains that had bound them for generations. Moses himself carried the weight of his role as herald of destruction with a heavy heart. Each plague required him to stand before Pharaoh and deliver warnings that he knew would be ignored, to watch as pride and stubbornness led to consequences that could have been avoided. The eighth plague would test not just Egyptian resolve, but Moses' own strength as he prepared to unleash forces that would reshape the kingdom forever. The hours before the locust swarms reached their full intensity were marked by an eerie calm, the kind of supernatural stillness that often precedes the most violent storms. Animals seemed to sense what was coming, clustering together in whatever shelter they could find, while humans went about their preparations with the mechanical efficiency of people who know they are powerless to change what is about to happen. And then, as the sun reached its zenith on what would become one of the darkest days in Egyptian history, the advance guard of the locust army arrived. Not in the gradual way of natural swarms, but all at once, as if a curtain of living darkness had been drawn across the sky. The sound was unlike anything the Egyptians had ever experienced, a deep thrumming that seemed to come from everywhere at once, vibrating through the ground and into the bones of every living creature. As we prepare to witness the full fury of the eighth plague, we stand at a crucial turning point in this ancient drama. The locusts that are about to descend upon Egypt represent more than just another demonstration of divine power. They embody the relentless nature of justice itself, the inevitable consequence of refusing to acknowledge truth when it is clearly presented. In the swirling clouds of insects that now darken the Egyptian sky, we see reflected the eternal struggle between pride and humility, between the desire to control and the wisdom to surrender. The stage is set for devastation unlike anything the ancient world has ever witnessed. A plague that will strip away the last vestiges of Egyptian confidence and bring even the mightiest kingdom on earth to the very edge of collapse. As the locusts begin their work of consumption and destruction, we witness not just the power of the Hebrew God, but the terrible beauty of divine justice finally, inexorably, having its way. As the final plague approaches, the very air of Egypt seems to hold its breath. The land that once basked in divine favor now trembles under the weight of accumulated judgments. 9 plagues have already swept across the kingdom, like waves of divine wrath, each one more devastating than the last. The Nile has turned to blood. Frogs have overrun the palaces. Gnats have tormented every living creature. Flies have swarmed in pestilent clouds. Livestock have perished in the fields. Boils have erupted on human and animal flesh alike. Hail has destroyed the crops. Locusts have devoured what remained, and darkness has blanketed the land for 3 days. Yet through it all, Pharaoh's heart has remained as unyielding as granite, his pride an immovable fortress against the voice of the Almighty. But now comes the 10th plague, the final judgment that will shatter even the mightiest resolve. This is not merely another demonstration of divine power. It is the climactic moment toward which all of history has been building, the ultimate confrontation between the will of God and the stubborn defiance of human pride. The death of the firstborn will sweep through Egypt like a silent angel, touching every household from the grandest palace to the humblest mud brick dwelling. No amount of wealth, no degree of power, no thickness of palace walls can shield anyone from this final visitation. In the royal quarters, Pharaoh sits upon his golden throne, perhaps for the last time in ignorant peace. The weight of the double crown feels heavier tonight, though he knows not why. His firstborn son sleeps in chambers not far away, the prince who carries within his young body all the hopes and dreams of a dynasty, the boy who will never grow to manhood, never ascend to the throne that has been his birthright since the moment of his birth. Around the palace, other Egyptian firstborn sons rest in their beds, noble children who have known only luxury and privilege, who have been groomed from infancy to inherit the wealth and status of their fathers. Beyond the palace walls, in the homes of priests and scribes, merchants and craftsmen, farmers and laborers, the same scene repeats itself countless times. Mothers tuck their eldest children into bed, fathers perhaps checking on their sleeping sons one final time before retiring for the night. These are ordinary people living ordinary lives, unaware that they stand on the threshold of the most extraordinary tragedy in human history. The Egyptian firstborn, from the heir apparent to the humblest servant's child, all rest peacefully in their beds, innocent victims of their ruler's intransigence. Meanwhile, in the Jewish quarter of Goshen, an entirely different scene unfolds. Here, families huddle together in their homes, the doorposts and lintels marked with the blood of the Passover lamb. They have followed Moses' instructions precisely, slaughtering the unblemished animal at twilight, catching its blood in basins, and applying it to their doorframes with hyssop branches. The smell of roasted lamb fills their homes as they partake of the hasty meal that will become known as the Passover feast, eating with their sandals on their feet, their staffs in their hands, ready for the journey that lies ahead. These Jewish families understand that they are witnessing the birth of their nation. Tonight, they cease to be merely Hebrew slaves and become the people of Israel. The blood on their doorposts is not just protection from the coming plague. It is a sign of their covenant with the God who is about to deliver them from bondage. Children ask their parents why this night is different from all other nights, and the parents explain that they are living through the fulfillment of promises made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob centuries before. As midnight approaches, the very fabric of reality seems to thin. The boundary between the natural and supernatural becomes permeable as the angel of death begins his solemn procession through the land of Egypt. This is no arbitrary act of divine cruelty, but the inevitable consequence of persistent rebellion against the will of the Almighty. Pharaoh has been given chance after chance to humble himself, to acknowledge the sovereignty of the God of Israel, to let the people go. 9 times he has hardened his heart. 9 times he has chosen his own will over divine command. The death that now stalks through Egypt is silent and swift. In the royal palace, it moves through chambers lined with gold and precious stones, past statues of gods who have proven powerless to protect their worshippers. The crown prince, heir to the throne of the mightiest empire on earth, simply stops breathing. There is no struggle, no cry of pain. One moment he lives, the next he is gone. In homes throughout the kingdom, the same scene repeats itself with heartbreaking consistency. The firstborn sons of Egypt, the future of their families and their nation, slip away into death as quietly as shadows dissolving at dawn. The psychological impact of this plague extends far beyond the immediate grief of bereaved families. In ancient Egyptian culture, the firstborn son was the carrier of the family legacy, the one who would inherit not only material wealth, but also the responsibility of maintaining the family's spiritual obligations to their ancestors. The death of the firstborn was not merely the loss of a child, it was the severing of the connection between past and future, the breaking of the chain that linked the living with the dead and the unborn. For Pharaoh himself, the death of his firstborn son represents the ultimate humiliation. Here is the man who has proclaimed himself a god, who has claimed divine authority over the lives and deaths of his subjects, and yet he cannot protect his own child from the judgment of the true God. The crown prince, groomed from birth to continue the divine monarchy, lies dead in his bed, a silent testimony to the impotence of human pride in the face of divine will. The theological implications of this final plague are profound and far-reaching. Throughout the preceding 9 plagues, God has systematically demonstrated his power over every aspect of the natural world that the Egyptians worship. The Nile, which they revere as a god, has been turned to blood. The sun god Ra has been eclipsed by supernatural darkness. The goddess of fertility has been powerless to protect their livestock. Now, in this final demonstration of divine sovereignty, God shows his power over life and death itself, claiming the firstborn of Egypt, just as Egypt has claimed the lives of Hebrew children. This plague also serves as a powerful prefiguration of future redemption. The blood of the Passover lamb that protects the Israelite firstborn points forward to another sacrifice that will protect all who believe from the judgment they deserve. The death angel that passes over the marked homes in Goshen foreshadows the way that divine wrath will pass over all who shelter under the blood of the ultimate Passover lamb. The deliverance that begins this night in Egypt anticipates a greater deliverance that will be accomplished on a hill outside Jerusalem many centuries later. As dawn breaks over the devastated land of Egypt, the full scope of the catastrophe becomes apparent. From the palace of Pharaoh to the dungeon of the prisoner, from the house of the wealthy merchant to the hut of the field laborer, the cry of mourning rises like incense toward the heavens. There is not a single Egyptian household that has not been touched by death. The sound of weeping mingles with the wailing of professional mourners, creating a symphony of grief that seems to echo from the very stones of the ancient pyramids. Pharaoh himself is transformed by this tragedy in ways that 9 previous plagues could not accomplish. The man who has repeatedly hardened his heart against the appeals of Moses and Aaron, who has watched his kingdom suffer plague after plague rather than admit defeat, is finally broken by the death of his own son. The crown that once felt like a symbol of divine authority now feels like a crushing weight of responsibility and failure. The throne room that once echoed with the confident commands of absolute monarchy now witnesses the desperate capitulation of a broken ruler. Summoning Moses and Aaron in the darkness before dawn, Pharaoh delivers the words that will echo through history. "Rise up, go out from among my people, both you and the children of Israel, and go, serve the Lord as you have said. Also take your flocks and your herds, as you have said, and be gone, and bless me also." These words represent more than mere permission to leave. They constitute a complete reversal of everything Pharaoh has stood for throughout the plague narrative. The man who once asked, "Who is the Lord that I should obey his voice?" now begs for the blessing of the God he has so long defied. But Pharaoh's capitulation extends beyond merely granting permission for the Israelites to leave. He actively urges them to go, driven by a terror that more judgment might fall if they remain. The Egyptians, too, are eager to see the back of these Hebrew slaves whose presence has brought such calamity upon their land. They shower the departing Israelites with gifts of silver and gold, precious clothing and valuable goods, partly out of genuine goodwill, but mostly out of desperate desire to see them gone before any further catastrophe can befall Egypt. This eager generosity on the part of the Egyptians fulfills yet another divine promise, that the Israelites would not leave Egypt empty-handed, but would plunder their former oppressors. The wealth that flows into Hebrew hands as they prepare to depart represents more than mere compensation for years of unpaid labor. It is the transfer of resources that will be needed for the construction of the tabernacle and the establishment of worship in the wilderness. the gold that will be melted down to form the mercy seat and the cherubim, the silver that will be used for the sockets of the tabernacle, the fine linen that will become the vestments of the priests. All of this wealth comes from Egyptian hands, freely given in the desperate hope that the God of Israel will be satisfied and will bring no more plagues upon the land. The exodus that follows represents one of the most significant population movements in ancient history. Conservative estimates suggest that between 2 and 3 million people participate in this great departure, not only the Hebrew descendants of Jacob, but also a mixed multitude of other peoples who have chosen to cast their lot with the God of Israel. The logistics of moving such a vast number of people are staggering to contemplate. Families pack their belongings in haste, loading donkeys and carts with the accumulated possessions of generations. Flocks and herds are gathered and organized for the journey ahead. Children are prepared for a march whose destination they cannot yet comprehend. The scene of departure is both chaotic and deeply moving. Elderly patriarchs who remember the stories of Joseph and the early years in Egypt are carried on the shoulders of their descendants, living links to a past that is now being left behind forever. Mothers clutch their infants close, uncertain what the future holds, but trusting in the God who has so powerfully demonstrated his care for his people. Young men drive the flocks and herds, while children dart between the animals, their excitement at the great adventure ahead mixing with anxiety about leaving the only home they have ever known. As the great procession makes its way out of the land of Egypt, the very landscape seems to watch their departure. The pyramids that have stood for centuries as monuments to pharaonic power and divine pretension now serve as silent witnesses to the triumph of the true God over the false gods of Egypt. The Sphinx, that enigmatic guardian of ancient mysteries, gazes impassively as the descendants of Abraham march past, carrying with them the promises of an even more ancient covenant. The route of the Exodus takes the Israelites not along the coastal road that would have been the most direct path to Canaan, but southward toward the Red Sea. This seemingly circuitous path serves multiple divine purposes. It keeps the newly liberated slaves away from the Philistine territories, where they might face immediate military conflict before they have been properly organized and trained. It leads them toward Mount Sinai, where they will receive the law that will transform them from a mob of refugees into a covenant nation. And it sets the stage for one final, decisive demonstration of divine power that will forever settle the question of who truly rules over the affairs of men and nations. For the plagues of Egypt are not merely historical events confined to the distant past. They are theological statements that echo through all of human history. They declare that there is no power on earth, no matter how mighty or seemingly permanent, that can successfully oppose the will of the Almighty. They demonstrate that human pride, no matter how deeply entrenched or stubbornly maintained, will ultimately be humbled before divine truth. They reveal that God's patience, while vast and enduring, is not infinite, and that persistent rebellion against his will inevitably leads to judgment. The Pharaoh who defied the God of Israel serves as a warning to all who would follow in his footsteps. Kings and presidents, dictators and democracies, corporations and institutions, all who set themselves against the purposes of God, will find themselves facing the same choice that confronted the ruler of Egypt. They can humble themselves and acknowledge divine sovereignty, or they can persist in their rebellion and face the consequences of their defiance. Yet the plagues also reveal the mercy that lies at the heart of divine judgment. Each plague was preceded by a warning. Each judgment was an opportunity for repentance. God did not desire the destruction of Egypt, but rather the liberation of his people and the demonstration of his glory to all nations. Even the final devastating plague of the death of the firstborn was not arbitrary cruelty, but the inevitable result of persistent hardness of heart. The blood on the doorposts of the Hebrew homes speaks of a protection that is available to all who will avail themselves of it. The Egyptian who chose to heed the warnings and take shelter with the Israelites would have found the same protection that covered the descendants of Jacob. The God who judged Egypt was the same God who offered salvation to any who would turn to him in faith. As we reflect on these ancient events from our modern perspective, we see in them patterns that continue to play out in our own time. The battle between divine will and human pride, the struggle between truth and falsehood, the choice between humble obedience and stubborn rebellion. These are not merely ancient themes, but contemporary realities that confront every generation. The plagues of Egypt remind us that history is not a random series of events, but a moral drama in which divine justice and mercy intersect with human choice and consequence. They assure us that no tyrant is so powerful, no system so entrenched, no opposition so formidable that it can ultimately prevail against the purposes of the Almighty. They encourage us to trust in the God who hears the cries of the oppressed and who acts decisively to deliver those who call upon his name. And they point us forward to an even greater exodus, a more complete deliverance, and a more perfect redemption, one that liberates not just from physical bondage, but from the slavery of sin itself, one that leads not just to an earthly promised land, but to an eternal inheritance that can never fade away. The 10th plague marks the end of one chapter in the story of God's people, but it is also the beginning of another. As the Israelites march out of Egypt in the early morning light, they carry with them not only the wealth of their former oppressors, but also the promises of their covenant God. They go forth not knowing exactly what lies ahead, but trusting in the one who has so powerfully demonstrated his ability to keep his word and fulfill his promises. Behind them, Egypt begins the long process of mourning its dead and counting the cost of its king's stubborn pride. Ahead of them lies the wilderness, with all its challenges and testings, its revelations and transformations. But with them goes the presence of the God who has proven himself mighty to save, faithful to his covenant, and absolutely sovereign over all the affairs of men and nations. The terrifying plagues of Egypt thus serve not only as historical records of divine judgment, but as eternal testimonies to the character of the God who will not be mocked, who cannot be defeated, and whose purposes will ultimately prevail in the earth. They remind us that we serve a God who is both just and merciful, both patient and decisive, both loving and holy, and they assure us that the same power that delivered Israel from Egypt is available to deliver us from whatever bondage may hold us captive, whatever Pharaoh may oppress us, whatever wilderness may lie before us. For the God of the Exodus is also the God of our salvation, and his mighty arm is not shortened that it cannot save, nor his ear heavy that it cannot hear the cries of those who call upon his name in faith. The first light of dawn spills gently across the endless sands of Egypt, touching the great river Nile with a shimmering veil of gold. In the distance, the pyramids rise like eternal sentinels, their massive stones catching the sun's first rays, as if to drink in the promise of a new day. But within the towering walls of the royal palace, the air is thick with a silence so profound it feels almost sacred. Here, behind gilded doors and stone corridors carved with the names of gods, the pharaoh lies awake, staring into the dim shadows that cling stubbornly to the corners of his chamber. Sleep has not visited him tonight, not truly, for even in the quietest hours, his mind has been burdened by the weight of a crown far heavier than gold alone could ever make it. The double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, symbol of his divine sovereignty, presses not upon his brow now, but upon his very soul. He feels its presence even as he lies beneath linen sheets woven so finely that they would be the envy of any mortal. The crown waits for him across the room, resting on its jeweled stand like a silent reminder that the moment he rises, he will cease being a man and once again become a god in the eyes of his people. But for a few precious minutes more, he allows himself this stillness, this fragile moment of anonymity that will vanish the instant servants begin their rituals. Here, in the pre-dawn hush, he is not Horus incarnate or the Lord of the Two Lands. He is simply a man, flesh and bone, breath and thought, lying in the quiet with the awareness that no other mortal could ever truly understand the solitude of his existence. The air in the chamber is cool, tinged with the faint scent of lotus blossoms drifting from bronze incense burners. Somewhere far below, the sound of the Nile's gentle current reaches his ears, a sound so ancient it might as well be the heartbeat of the earth itself. The pharaoh closes his eyes, trying for a moment to let its rhythm quiet the storm within him. But the stillness brings no peace, only the rising memory of the day ahead and the knowledge of the countless eyes that will watch his every move. For the pharaoh's day is not his own. From the moment he sets foot on the cold stone floor, his existence becomes a performance, every gesture imbued with cosmic significance, every breath a component of the great machinery of Ma'at, the divine order that holds chaos at bay. He is not merely expected to rule wisely or command armies. He must embody the divine, becoming the living hinge upon which the balance of heaven and earth depends. He recalls the words drilled into him from childhood. You are Horus on earth. You are the son of Ra. To falter is to invite disorder. To doubt is to open the gates to chaos. You must be perfect, for the universe demands perfection. But as he lies there, staring at the intricate ceiling where painted gods look down in eternal judgment, he feels anything but perfect. He feels the subtle ache in his back from the long ceremonies of the previous day, the faint tightness in his chest that comes in waves now when the anxiety surges too strongly. He wonders, not for the first time, if the gods see these weaknesses. A soft knock at the door. The sound is barely audible, but it carries the weight of inevitability. The hour has come. The first of his attendants awaits permission to enter. The pharaoh draws a slow breath, willing his face into the mask of divine serenity that the world expects of him. Whatever fear or fatigue he carries must remain invisible, locked away in the hidden chambers of his mind, where no mortal or god can peer. Enter, he says, his voice calm, measured, already taking on the tone of a man who speaks not as a human, but as a deity. The door opens silently, and a procession of servants files in with practiced precision. They bow low, eyes to the floor, never daring to look directly at the figure who, to them, is not a man, but a walking incarnation of the gods themselves. Without a word, they begin their sacred duties. The royal barber approaches first, carrying a tray of scented oils and alabaster jars. He begins the ritual cleansing of the pharaoh's face and head, careful to remove any sign of human frailty, sweat, blemish, imperfection. Then come the priests with bowls of sacred water drawn from the Nile at sunrise, chanting prayers as they pour the cool liquid over the pharaoh's skin. The chill raises goose flesh along his arms, but he does not flinch. He must not flinch. Even a shiver could be interpreted as a divine omen, and the priests would spend hours debating its meaning. One servant anoints his body with frankincense and myrrh, their heady fragrance rising to fill the room. Another brings forth the garments of state, fine linen robes so sheer they seem spun from moonlight, their borders embroidered with gold thread that glints faintly in the lamplight. The pharaoh raises his arms, allowing himself to be dressed, transformed from mortal flesh into a living god. Finally, the crown. The double crown of red and white, symbol of Upper and Lower Egypt united under his rule. It is heavy, not just in weight, but in meaning. As it is placed gently upon his head, the pharaoh feels its crushing symbolic gravity settle over him. His reflection in the polished copper mirror shows not a man of 32 summers, weary-eyed from another sleepless night, but a deity whose image will be carved into temples and chanted in hymns long after his body has turned to dust. The transformation is complete. Whatever vulnerability lingered in those pre-dawn moments has been sealed away. To the world, he is no longer a man. He is Pharaoh. He is power made flesh, the eternal protector of Ma'at, the unshakable center of the universe. But deep within, in a place no priest can reach, he knows the truth. He knows that beneath the golden regalia, beneath the layers of ritual and divinity, there still beats the fragile heart of a man who wonders, quietly, secretly, whether even gods can bear such a burden forever. The sun, now risen above the horizon, cast its first golden light through the high windows of the palace temple, turning dust motes into drifting sparks of fire. Outside, the vast courtyards awaken with the sound of sandals on stone, murmured prayers, and the rustling of linen as priests and officials gather in precise formation. The pharaoh walks among them, a solitary figure at the center of this great choreographed dance of reverence. He glides forward, each step measured and deliberate, his posture impeccable, his face carved into the expression of calm omnipotence expected of him. He is not permitted to stumble, not permitted even the faintest hesitation, for every gesture, every blink of his eyes carries cosmic weight. Here, in the sacred heart of Egypt's most magnificent palace, he is not simply a ruler. He is the axis around which all creation turns. At his approach, hundreds of priests drop to their knees in unison, their foreheads touching the cool, polished limestone. The sound of their robes whispering against the floor rises like a soft sigh, echoing through the vast hall. None dare lift their eyes until the pharaoh has passed. To look upon him directly without permission is to invite ruin, for his divine essence is considered too radiant for mortal sight. The air is heavy with incense. Sweet clouds of frankincense and myrrh rise from golden burners held aloft by acolytes, the smoke curling and twisting toward the vaulted ceilings like ethereal serpents. Light filters through narrow slits high above, slicing the smoky air into beams that illuminate the hieroglyphs carved deep into the walls. Stories of creation, of divine battles, of the unbroken line of pharaohs from the first king to the present, each stone telling of immortality, each image reinforcing the great fiction that here in this palace time does not erode and humanity does not intrude. The pharaoh ascends the steps of the inner sanctuary, his sandals brushing against rose petals scattered in his path. Two high priests move ahead of him, swinging censers and chanting in low voices, their words ancient and potent, meant to cleanse the space of any lingering chaos. The chant is hypnotic, almost a song, yet carries with it an undercurrent of fear. Even they, custodians of sacred wisdom, tremble inwardly in the presence of the living God. At the sanctuary doors, gilded and inlaid with lapis lazuli, attendants halt. Only the pharaoh and the two high priests may enter. As the doors open with a deep, resonant creak, the scent of lotus blossoms intensifies. Inside waits the image of Amun-Ra, the supreme deity, carved from black granite, his features stern yet compassionate, his gaze fixed eternally on the soul of Egypt's ruler. Here begins the central ritual of the day, the offering to the god. The pharaoh stands in silence for a moment, gazing upon the massive statue, aware that though it is stone, though it is cold and lifeless to any other man, to him it is alive. It sees him, it judges him. He feels the weight of unseen eyes pressing upon his shoulders, the gods themselves, Ra and Osiris, Horus and Isis, all watching, awaiting proof of his worthiness to bear their mantle on earth. One high priest hands him the sacred censer, its golden chains cool against his skin. Slowly, gracefully, the pharaoh swings it 3 times to the left, then 3 times to the right, releasing plumes of perfumed smoke that coil upward and dissipate into the heavens. Each motion is precise, rehearsed since childhood. A single misstep, too fast, too wide, and the priests would whisper of omens, of displeasure from the divine. Next, he takes a carved alabaster bowl filled with milk and honey, offering it to the statue with outstretched arms. The words he speaks are not his own, but ancient invocations, in a language so old that few priests understand every syllable. Yet he pronounces them flawlessly. He must. The entire kingdom's stability rests on the perfection of this exchange between man and God. O Amun-Ra, who rides the solar bark, who breathes life into the 2 lands, accept this humble offering from your son, your servant, your living vessel. May Ma'at endure. May chaos be kept at bay. May your light never falter. The words reverberate softly against the stone walls, disappearing into the vastness of the sanctuary. Somewhere deep inside, the pharaoh wonders if anyone, anything, truly hears. The ritual continues. He pours sacred wine at the feet of the statue, sprinkles grains of barley over the altar, places garlands of papyrus reeds across the god's carved chest. With each act, he reinforces his role as intermediary between the heavens and the earth, his movements a bridge between mortal and immortal realms. But as he kneels before the altar, forehead pressed to the cold stone, a sliver of doubt pricks his mind. What if he falters? What if he has already failed and doesn't yet know it? He forces the thought away. There is no room for uncertainty in the heart of a god. When the final prayers are spoken, the high priests bow deeply and retreat. The pharaoh remains alone in the sanctuary for a few heartbeats longer, allowing himself a silent sigh. Here, alone with the gods, he feels the crushing isolation of his divinity most keenly. For to be a god is to be apart, not above, not below, but utterly apart from all others. Emerging from the sanctuary, he steps back into the great hall. The priests rise as one, heads still bowed, and begin the hymn of adoration. The sound swells and fills the air, 100 voices chanting his titles. Horus, the mighty bull, the lord of appearances, the golden falcon, he who upholds Ma'at, the uniter of the 2 lands. Each epithet weighs upon him like another stone block added to the burden he already carries. He moves among them with the solemn grace of one who knows every eye is upon him, every gesture a symbol, every word a decree that could alter the fate of thousands. As he exits the temple, the sun has fully risen. Its rays strike the white limestone of the palace walls, dazzling and pure. But to the pharaoh, the light feels heavy, almost oppressive. He shields his eyes slightly, just enough that it could be interpreted as reverence for Ra's brilliance. Inside, he is simply weary. The rituals are complete for now, but the performance will continue until the sun sets again, for there is no respite for a man who must live as a god. There is only the endless choreography of power, the sacred motions that keep the universe from falling into chaos. And as he walks toward the audience chamber, preparing to face supplicants and ambassadors, he steels himself for the next act in the divine theatre. Another day of perfection awaits. Another day where the weight of Egypt, of the cosmos itself, will rest upon his human frame, hidden beneath golden linen and perfumed oils. The palace is a fortress of stillness and ceremony, but beyond its gilded gates, the land of Egypt breathes with a different rhythm, a softer, older rhythm untouched by royal protocol or sacred incantations. Here, The Nile winds its sinuous path through fields of emerald and gold, its waters glittering under the high sun like a living artery, carrying life to every corner of the kingdom. From his vantage point atop the palace balcony, the pharaoh surveys his domain. The view stretches endlessly, a canvas of green and ochre bordered by the ever-encroaching desert sands. Villages dot the landscape like scattered jewels, each cluster of mud brick homes surrounded by fields of barley and flax, swaying gently in the morning breeze. In the distance, smoke rises lazily from cooking fires, and the faint murmur of human voices drifts upward, a lullaby of life far removed from the rigid formality of the royal court. Children splash in irrigation canals, their laughter high and unrestrained, echoing across the fields. Farmers in linen kilts bend low over the soil, their dark hands skillful and sure as they guide wooden ploughs pulled by oxen. Women balance baskets of grain on their heads, moving with the easy grace of those who have walked these paths since time immemorial. Even the animals, cattle grazing, ibises stalking the shallows, seem to take their places in this timeless tableau with perfect, unthinking harmony. The pharaoh watches in silence, his expression unreadable to any who might dare glance up. Outwardly, he appears the unshakable God-King, the axis of Ma'at, the embodiment of eternal order. But within, a quiet ache unfurls. For all their struggles and simplicity, the people below live lives of unencumbered authenticity, free to laugh, to weep, to embrace one another without fear of cosmic consequence. He envies them. Though he has wealth beyond imagining, palaces adorned with lapis and gold, servants ready to fulfill his every whim, and a kingdom that bends to his will, he envies the farmer who sings as he scatters seed across the tilled earth, whose only audience is the river breeze. He envies the mother who gathers her children into her arms at night without thinking of omens, without worrying whether her gesture carries divine significance. He envies even the old man dozing in the shade of a sycamore, unburdened by crowns or thrones, whose dreams are his alone. For the pharaoh has no such luxury. Every word he speaks, every motion he makes, every decision he contemplates is imbued with layers of meaning and consequence that stretch far beyond his own life. If the Nile does not rise to its proper height, it is said to be a reflection of his spiritual failings. If crops wither, if locusts swarm, if foreign armies press against Egypt's borders, the people will whisper that their God-King has displeased the heavens. And so he carries their fortunes, their very survival, upon his solitary shoulders. It is a weight too vast for any human, and yet he must bear it without complaint, for to falter is to let chaos seep into the world. His gaze shifts to a group of children running barefoot across a dusty path, their laughter ringing like temple bells. For an instant, his mask slips, and he allows himself the fleeting fantasy of joining them, casting off his jeweled crown, his linen robes, his divine facade to run free in the sun, with the wind in his hair and the dust on his feet. But the vision vanishes as quickly as it comes, crushed beneath the inexorable gravity of his role. A high priest approaches from behind, bowing low before daring to speak. "My lord, the envoys from Kush await your audience." The pharaoh gives a single, almost imperceptible nod. He does not turn from the window. He watches as a fisherman poles his reed skiff along the Nile's edge, the water rippling in perfect concentric circles that spread outward until they touch the reeds and vanish. Such small, ordinary acts, and yet how profound they seem to him now. The priest waits in silence, understanding the sanctity of the pharaoh's gaze. To disturb his contemplation too soon would be sacrilege. Finally, the pharaoh straightens. His face is once again the mask of divine authority, his inner longing buried deep beneath layers of ritual and duty. He speaks with the calm resonance of a god addressing a mortal. See that they are received in the hall of pillars. I will come shortly." The priest bows again and retreats. The pharaoh remains at the window for a moment longer, watching the sunlight glitter on the Nile's surface. To his people, the river is a giver of life, a sacred conduit between earth and sky. To him, it is a mirror, reflecting both the beauty of Egypt and the unrelenting weight of responsibility that comes with ruling it. As he turns from the view, the sounds of the palace resume their measured cadence. Footsteps on stone, whispers of attendants preparing for the day's audiences, the faint clang of bronze as soldiers change their posts. The divine theatre begins anew. But in the quiet recesses of his mind, the pharaoh carries the memory of that fisherman on the Nile, the children's laughter in the fields, the mother's gentle hands brushing a child's cheek. These fleeting glimpses of ordinary humanity remain with him like forbidden treasures, reminders of a life he can never lead, a freedom he can never taste. And so, as he steps into the corridors once more, he dons not just his crown and his robes, but the unyielding armor of godhood. The land watches its king, and though they cannot see his human heart, it beats all the same, longing, aching, and utterly alone. The great palace of Pharaoh is a marvel to behold, a sprawling labyrinth of alabaster halls, towering columns carved with sacred hieroglyphs, and chambers lined with lapis and gold. Yet for all its grandeur, it is a prison of the most exquisite kind, a place where silence reigns, and even whispers echo like accusations. As Pharaoh retreats from the audience chamber, his footsteps barely audible on the polished limestone, he feels the familiar weight settle upon him. It is not the physical burden of the double crown, nor the ornate regalia that weighs so heavily, but the crushing loneliness that has followed him like a shadow since the moment he first ascended the throne. He moves through his private corridors, past servants who flatten themselves against the walls at his passing, their eyes fixed on the floor in perfect deference. They dare not speak unless spoken to, dare not meet his gaze. Even here, in the most intimate part of the palace, the protocols of divinity persist. The doors to his inner chambers open without a sound, and Pharaoh steps into a room more magnificent than any mortal could imagine. Walls gilded with scenes of triumph and divine favor, floors inlaid with precious stones that catch the light of flickering oil lamps, furniture carved from ebony and ivory, draped in fine linens embroidered with symbols of eternity. But despite the splendor, there is an unmistakable emptiness to the space, a hollow silence that no amount of wealth can fill. This is the place where Pharaoh eats, sleeps, and dreams alone. Even in moments meant for rest, he is never free from the gaze of the gods. A low table has been set for his evening meal. Golden platters hold figs, pomegranates, roasted meats seasoned with rare spices from distant lands. Fine wine gleams like rubies in crystal goblets. Yet Pharaoh does not approach. He stands at the window instead, staring out at the night sky, where countless stars scatter across the blackness like shards of crushed diamonds. He wonders if Ra himself looks down upon him now, the great sun god watching his chosen vessel with approval, or perhaps disappointment. Behind him, servants slip silently into the room, removing his ceremonial attire piece by piece. The crook and flail, symbols of his authority, are placed reverently upon a marble pedestal. The heavy broad collar of gold and carnelian is unclasped with care, its absence leaving a faint ache in his shoulders. As the last layers of divine regalia are removed, Pharaoh feels strangely exposed, like a soldier stripped of his armor. He is no longer the Horus in the flesh, no longer the eternal protector of Ma'at. Here, in these private moments, he is simply a man, but a man still trapped in the role of a god. His attendants bow and retreat, leaving him in solitude. The doors close with a muted thud, and the sound reverberates through the chamber like the tolling of a distant bell. Pharaoh lowers himself onto a cushioned bench near the window. The moonlight spills across his face, illuminating features that are both youthful and weary. He is not old by mortal standards, yet lines have begun to etch themselves into his brow, faint creases born of sleepless nights and unending vigilance. He thinks of his wives, women chosen for their noble bloodlines, for the political alliances their unions forged. They too are bound by protocol, their interactions with him governed by ritual and hierarchy. Even in the privacy of their shared chambers, their words are measured, their affection tempered by deference. They speak to him not as a man, but as a god, and in doing so, remind him of the unbridgeable chasm between what he is and what he was meant to be. Pharaoh has children as well, princes and princesses who will one day inherit fragments of his legacy. But they too are kept at a distance, raised by tutors and overseers who ensure they understand the sacredness of their lineage. They bow before him, address him in tones of reverence, and avert their eyes when he enters the room. What child dares to embrace a god? And so he eats alone, he walks alone, he dreams alone. The feast laid before him remains untouched. He has no appetite. The aroma of spiced lamb and baked dates fills the air, but it only makes the hollowness inside him more acute. He could summon a servant to join him, not to share the meal, for such a thing would be unthinkable, but simply to sit in his presence. Yet he knows the result would be no different. They would bow, avert their gaze, answer only in monosyllables. The room would still feel empty. Sometimes he wishes he could dismiss the divine facade entirely, step into the world beyond the palace as an ordinary man, free to speak and be spoken to without ceremony. But he knows it is impossible. The mask of godhood cannot be removed. It was placed upon him in childhood, and it will remain until his final breath. The solitude presses tighter around him, like the coiled body of a serpent. Even the painted gods on his chamber walls seem to watch him with unblinking eyes. Their eternal gazes a reminder that his every thought and feeling is under scrutiny, not just from his subjects, but from the divine realm itself. He rises and paces the room, his bare feet silent on the cold stone floor. He stops before a tall bronze mirror, its surface polished to a perfect sheen. The face that stares back at him is strong, symmetrical, the face of a ruler whose likeness is carved into temples and monuments across the land. But in the eyes he sees something the sculptors could never capture, a deep, unspoken longing. A longing to be touched without reverence, spoken to without caution, loved without fear. He places a hand upon the mirror's surface, as though reaching for the reflection of a man he barely recognizes. The glass is cool beneath his palm. Some nights, when the loneliness becomes unbearable, he visits a hidden chamber within the palace, a small room where he has gathered tokens of a simpler existence. A clay cup he molded as a child, a reed flute he once played before his voice changed with age, a faded strip of linen from his mother's garments, kept for its faint scent of home. Here, he feels closer to the boy he once was than the god he has become. But even these secret visits bring little comfort, for he knows the truth. The boy no longer exists. He was sacrificed upon the altar of kingship the day Pharaoh ascended the throne. A faint sound draws his attention, the cry of an infant drifting through the palace walls. One of his concubine's children, perhaps. The sound is soft, human, unrestrained. It pierces his heart in a way no priestly chant or royal decree ever could. He wonders what it would feel like to lift a child into his arms without ceremony, to hold it close and feel its tiny fingers grasp his own. But such acts are not for gods. Outside, the wind shifts, rattling the shutters. Pharaoh turns away from the mirror and moves to the window once more. The city lies silent under the moonlight, its streets deserted, save for the occasional flicker of a watchman's torch. Beyond, The Nile gleams like a silver serpent, winding its way through the darkness. He rests a hand on the cold stone of the windowsill, staring out at the sleeping world. They dream in their homes, unaware of the man standing above them, unaware that their God-King dreams too. But his dreams are not of power or glory. They are of laughter shared around a humble fire, of hands clasped in friendship, of a heart unburdened by the crushing expectations of divinity. The weight of his isolation is suffocating. And yet, as the night deepens, Pharaoh knows that when the sun rises again, he will don the mask once more. He will sit upon his throne, receive the supplications of his people, preside over rituals designed to affirm his godhood, for he is Pharaoh, and Pharaoh does not falter. Not in the eyes of the world, not even in the face of a loneliness so profound it threatens to consume him whole. The human body was never meant to carry the weight of eternity. Yet this is the expectation placed upon Pharaoh, his frame no longer his own, but a sacred vessel, a living symbol of divinity and strength. To his people he is immutable, eternal, an earthly incarnation of Horus, whose flesh and bone have been perfected by the gods themselves. But within the silent confines of his private chambers, when the gold and linen have been set aside, he feels the truth of his mortality in every aching joint and every labored breath. This morning, like so many before, begins with the ritual examination. The royal physicians arrive at first light, their faces hidden behind linen veils, scented faintly of lotus and myrrh. They bow deeply before the God-King, but their eyes, when they dare glance at him, are sharp, calculating, seeking any sign that the divine vessel might be weakening. The examination is a sacred duty. His body is not simply his own. It belongs to Egypt, to the gods, to the great cosmic balance of Ma'at. Every blemish, every swelling, every slight tremor of his hands could be interpreted as a warning, a signal that chaos stirs, that the divine order is threatened. Pharaoh sits motionless on a carved ebony stool, the light from a high window falling across his bare shoulders. His skin, though carefully anointed each day with sacred oils, shows faint bruises where ceremonial regalia has pressed too hard. A deep ache lingers in his lower back from the long hours spent standing rigid in temple rites. His knees protest with a subtle stiffness each time he rises from his throne, though no one in the audience chamber would ever notice. The chief physician kneels before him now, gently lifting his right arm to check the tension in his muscles. The man's touch is careful, reverent, but Pharaoh feels the prickle of humiliation all the same. He forces his features into the mask of calm omnipotence. No flinch, no wince, no hint of discomfort may be shown. A god does not suffer. Yet inside, a sharp pang flares in his shoulder as the physician rotates the joint. The pain is manageable, but persistent, like a whisper, reminding him that divinity cannot erase human frailty. He remembers the last time he practiced the archery rituals of Horus, how his arm had trembled after a mere hour, how the priests had whispered nervously that the tremor was a sign of some cosmic imbalance. The physician murmurs soft words in the old tongue, requesting permission to inspect his chest. Pharaoh nods imperceptibly. Fingers press against his ribcage, tracing the outlines of muscles kept lean by daily exercise, but beginning to lose the tautness of youth. At 35, he is no longer the young warrior prince who once led chariot charges across the Sinai. The years weigh heavier now, and so too does the crown. His breath catches faintly as the physician's hands move lower, pressing gently against his abdomen. There has been discomfort there lately, a vague sense of heaviness after meals, occasional pangs sharp enough to wake him at night. He has told no one. To speak of it would be to invite endless scrutiny, consultations, ritual purifications. Better to endure in silence. Your Majesty's pulse is strong, the physician intones with practiced neutrality. The gods favor your health. The words are ritual, not reassurance. Both men know the truth. Health is a fragile illusion, maintained through discipline, ceremony, and sheer willpower. As the physicians withdraw, bowing low before disappearing into the shadows beyond the chamber doors, Pharaoh exhales slowly. He is alone again. Alone with the knowledge that his body, for all its sacred adornments, is subject to the same laws of flesh as any farmer tilling the fields or soldier guarding the city gates. He rises from the stool and crosses to the bathing chamber, where attendants have drawn a bath of warm water infused with sacred oils. As he lowers himself into the basin, a sigh escapes him unbidden. The heat soothes the soreness in his back, the stiffness in his joints, but it cannot wash away the deeper fatigue that coils within his bones like a serpent. He closes his eyes and remembers his father, the previous pharaoh in his final years. A man once mighty, reduced to a husk of himself, his legs too weak to stand for ceremonies, his mind clouded with fevers and forgetfulness. Pharaoh had watched him with a mixture of sorrow and fear, understanding even then that divinity offered no exemption from decay. Now, in his own reign, he wonders if the same fate awaits him. Will his hands tremble visibly one day during the offering to the gods? Will his voice falter in the great hall as he addresses his people? Will the priests whisper behind his back of omens, of a failing link between heaven and earth? The thought is unbearable. He must not weaken. He must not falter. For to falter is to let Egypt slip toward disorder, to let Ma'at unravel. He emerges from the bath, water cascading down skin polished with sacred unguents. Attendants rush to dry him with linen cloths as soft as clouds. Another applies kohl around his eyes, restoring the image of strength and vitality that the people must see. But beneath the painted lines and golden raiments, the truth remains. His body is mortal, fragile, finite. Every breath, every heartbeat is a borrowed gift. And so, he resolves, as he does each morning, to push the weakness deeper, to lock it away where no one, not even he, can see it. The God King cannot afford to be human. Not yet. It begins on the very day of his coronation. The ink on the royal decrees has scarcely dried. The hymns of adoration still echo through the palace halls, and yet already plans are drawn, architects summoned, and laborers conscripted. For Pharaoh's reign, though gilded in divine light, is but a fleeting shadow. His earthly journey, no matter how glorious, will end as all mortal journeys do, with death. And so, from his first day as God King, the long meticulous work of preparing for eternity begins. Today, years into his reign, Pharaoh stands upon a high bluff overlooking the western desert. Before him sprawls a hive of activity, thousands of men laboring under the merciless sun, their bronzed bodies glistening with sweat, their movements rhythmic and tireless. The air is thick with the clatter of chisels against limestone, the groan of wooden sledges dragged across sand, and the shouted orders of overseers urging the workers ever forward. This is not merely construction. It is a sacred endeavor, a monumental act of devotion to ensure that Pharaoh's soul may journey safely to the afterlife. His tomb is rising, not a simple resting place, but an entire complex of chambers, passageways, and sanctuaries, carved deep into the living rock and adorned with scenes of cosmic significance. It is a place where his mortal remains will lie in state for eternity, surrounded by treasures, prayers, and magic designed to sustain his ka, the vital essence of his being, in the next world. Pharaoh watches in silence as hundreds of workers strain to maneuver an immense stone block up an inclined causeway. The block is destined for the burial chamber's outer wall, where it will seal his body within a fortress of stone. Whips crack in the hot air, urging the men to pull harder, faster. Their faces are taut with effort, their feet slipping in the sand. Some falter, a few collapse, none stop, for they know this is the work of eternity. To Pharaoh, it is both comforting and haunting. Each stone set in place brings his vision of immortality closer, and yet with each stone he is reminded, one day it will be his body laid within these walls, his breath stilled, his voice silenced. The tomb waits patiently, a silent and unjudging witness to his life, ready to receive him when his divine spark flickers out. The architects approach with rolls of papyrus, unspooling floor plans and renderings. They describe secret passages designed to confound tomb robbers, hidden chambers where treasures will be stored, false doors through which his spirit may pass unhindered. Priests speak of spells and incantations to be painted along the walls, texts from the Book of the Dead that will guide Pharaoh through the treacherous landscape of Duat, the underworld. Scenes of the afterlife are already taking form in vibrant pigments. The weighing of Pharaoh's heart against the feather of Ma'at, his triumphant voyage on the solar bark with Ra, his resurrection under the watchful eyes of Osiris. Artisans labor with exquisite care, their hands steady as they carve hieroglyphs meant to last beyond the crumbling of empires. Pharaoh steps closer, trailing his fingers lightly along a newly finished wall. The figures are lifelike, almost breathing, their colors vivid against the pale stone. Here, he is depicted offering incense to the gods. There, embracing his ancestors in the fields of reeds, a paradise where the blessed dead reap eternal harvests. It is beautiful. It is terrifying. For all its splendor, this place is a reminder that even a god-king is not exempt from the pull of the grave. It whispers to him of his own fragility, of the day when his body will be wrapped in linen and sealed within the sarcophagus, while priests chant prayers to protect his journey. He has already chosen the treasures that will accompany him: golden statues, alabaster jars filled with sacred oils, amulets inscribed with protective spells, chests of jewelry, weapons for defense in the afterlife, furniture for his eternal comfort. Even his favorite hounds, now alive and frolicking in the palace gardens, will one day lie mummified at his feet in the burial chamber. Yet perhaps the most chilling detail of all is the quiet roster kept by royal scribes, a list of the living who will not remain so. Servants and attendants selected to accompany Pharaoh into eternity, their fate sealed not by malice, but by devotion. It is an honor, they are told. It is necessity, the priests insist. For what is a king in the next world without his household to serve him? Pharaoh turns his gaze back to the laborers, their bodies bent under crushing loads. He knows that for many this tomb will be the last thing they ever build. Accidents are common, heat stroke frequent. The desert takes its toll without mercy. Yet the work continues, for the glory of Pharaoh is the glory of Egypt, and the glory of Egypt must endure. As the sun climbs higher, its heat pressing down like a physical weight, Pharaoh retreats into the shade of a temporary pavilion erected for his inspection tours. There, he sips cool water from a chalice of electrum, his eyes still fixed on the growing edifice in the distance. He thinks of the countless generations before him, each pharaoh entombed in splendor, their names once spoken in reverence, but now fading from memory. How many of their tombs have been violated? How many of their treasures plundered? How many of their mummies lie unrecognized, stripped of the gold and linen that once proclaimed their divinity? This thought is unbearable. His tomb must be different, stronger, more hidden, more sacred. It must preserve his name for eternity, ensure his car's survival in the next world, and keep his memory alive as long as the Nile flows. Yet deep within, a quiet doubt stirs. What if even these efforts are not enough? What if the priest's spells fail? What if the gods themselves turn away? Pharaoh closes his eyes, feeling the faint pulse in his temples. It is a human heartbeat, steady but fragile, echoing in the silence of his skull. He forces the thought aside. There is no room for doubt in the heart of a god. When he opens his eyes again, the tomb remains there, waiting, a massive, unblinking eye in the desert, gazing back at him with patient inevitability. It will wait as long as it must. For eternity begins not in the afterlife, but here, in the shadows of stone rising under a relentless sun. It is subtle at first, an almost imperceptible shift, like the faint stirring of wind before a sandstorm. But for those attuned to the rhythms of the land, the signs are undeniable. Farmers glance nervously at the skies. Priests offer longer prayers than usual, and merchants whisper in hushed tones behind closed doors. Something unseen moves through the kingdom, a shadow stretching long and cold across the two lands. Pharaoh senses it too. He stands upon a high terrace as dusk settles over the city, the light of Ra bleeding into deep crimson along the horizon. Below, the streets of Thebes are uncharacteristically quiet. The usual hum of life, the laughter of children, the calls of vendors, the songs of boatmen on the Nile, has dulled, replaced by a tense stillness. Smoke curls lazily from cooking fires, carrying with it the aroma of lentils and roasted fowl. But even the scents seem muted tonight, as though the very air holds its breath. Reports have begun to reach the palace. A strange sickness among the cattle in the delta. Herds lying motionless in the fields, their bodies bloated under the harsh sun. Crops wilting inexplicably despite careful irrigation, the once fertile soil turning to dust in the farmers' hands. Frogs in numbers too great to count, their croaking so loud in some villages that it drowns out human voices. And now, rumours of swarms of insects, gnats and flies, clouding the skies, biting animals and men alike, leaving trails of welts and fever in their wake. Pharaoh has dismissed them all as exaggerations, the usual mutterings of a superstitious populace too quick to assign meaning to misfortune. Egypt is vast. In so great a land, surely there are always pockets of hardship, poor harvests, minor plagues, the ebb and flow of the Nile's favour. It is not chaos. It is not his fault. And yet, in the palace the priests murmur among themselves in voices they think he cannot hear. They speak of omens and portents, of a foreign god whose name now ripples like a dark current through the lower classes, Yahweh, a strange deity of a strange people, the Hebrews, whose leader Moses has come before Pharaoh demanding release for his enslaved brethren, demanding of all things in the name of this god. Pharaoh remembers their meeting well. Moses, once a prince of Egypt, now standing before him in coarse robes, eyes burning not with fear, but with a calm authority that was unsettling. The memory of their exchange lingers like a thorn. "Who is Yahweh?" Pharaoh had asked with a sneer, "that I should obey his voice and let Israel go? I do not know this God, and I will not release his people." The words had been spoken with conviction then, but now, in the stillness of his chambers, he feels a faint tremor of doubt. Could these afflictions truly be linked to Moses' God? He brushes the thought aside with practiced force. Number. He is Pharaoh. He is the embodiment of Horus, the living son of Ra. Egypt's pantheon is vast and powerful. Their temples are filled with offerings, their priests skilled in rites as old as time itself. No foreign deity can challenge such strength. And yet, tonight the wind carries an unfamiliar scent, sweet and cloying, yet with an edge of rot. He breathes deeply, trying to name it, but cannot. It feels out of place, unnatural, as though the land itself exudes a nervous sweat. Servants approach cautiously with lamps to banish the gathering darkness. Their faces are strained, their movements stiff. Pharaoh notices. They bow lower than usual, their eyes fixed firmly on the floor. He senses their fear, not of him, but of something else, something beyond the palace walls. Later, in the great hall, his advisors gather. They bring charts and reports, voices carefully modulated to avoid alarm. But beneath their formal tones, Pharaoh detects an undercurrent of unease. "My lord," one begins, "we have taken measures. The priests of Sekhmet are performing daily rites to drive away pestilence. Offerings have been doubled at the temple of Heket to appease her in the matter of the frogs. Sacred charms are being distributed to the farmers. These disturbances will pass, as they always do." Pharaoh nods, but says nothing. Another advisor, braver or more desperate, ventures further. "Perhaps, my lord, perhaps this is the work of the Hebrews' God. Perhaps—" The words hang in the air like a foul stench. All heads turn sharply toward the speaker, eyes wide with horror at his audacity. Pharaoh's own gaze fixes upon him, cold and unblinking. "Perhaps?" Pharaoh's voice is soft, dangerously so. "Do you suggest, counselor, that Egypt's gods are powerless? That I, Pharaoh, am powerless?" The man's skin pales visibly. He drops to his knees, pressing his forehead to the floor. "Never, my lord. Forgive me. My tongue outran my wisdom." Pharaoh's fingers tighten around the arms of his gilded throne. He feels the familiar surge of anger, but beneath it, a flicker of something more dangerous: uncertainty. That night, sleep eludes him again. He walks the palace corridors, his footsteps echoing off stone walls carved with scenes of his own victories, his own divinity immortalized in paint and gold. But those images feel hollow now, as though they belong to someone else. He passes a window and pauses. Outside, the Nile glimmers faintly under the moonlight, its surface smooth as obsidian. For centuries, it has been Egypt's lifeline, its cycles of flood and retreat, as steady as the heartbeat of the land itself. But what if? Number. He forces the thought away. And yet, deep in his gut, he feels it. The balance of Ma'at is shifting. Something is coming. Something vast, unseen, unstoppable. The shadow of plagues lengthens, and Egypt, for the first time in centuries, trembles.